Okay. Process cost. So here's a comparison. Process costing. You keep track of the costs in each department. So there's the answer. You have a work in process inventory account for that department. So when that department transfers that inventory off to the next department, the costs also go out of that work in process inventory into another work in process inventory account for the next department. And let's see, we have to use this concept of equivalent units. Remember that from Tuesday? Especially in terms of conversion, right? Why was that? Why do we need this concept of equivalent units? If it's the end of the month, you've got some work in process inventory, it might not be completely converted, right? So we need a way to, like in the pizza analogy, take those pizzas, some of them partial pizzas, and figure out how many pizzas is this, right? So what is the equivalent unit that we have converted? And we do that with a percentage that comes from production, where they might tell you, hey, we are 35% done converting this particular batch of 1,000 units. Then you take the number of units times that percentage, and that's your equivalent units for the purposes of conversion. And you might remember the reason we have to do that and get that answer is so we can figure out what is the cost per unit. If you don't know how many units you're dealing with, or equivalent units, you can't figure out your cost per unit. So, covered pretty much all of that. So we looked at how we have multiple departments theoretically involved with production, right? So in process costing, each department has their own work in process account. They keep track of anything that got transferred in. So if you are in the dough molding department, whatever costs went into the dough, the material, the labor, any overhead that got applied here gets transferred when the product gets transferred to your department. So you absorb those costs, but then you add more costs, right? You add your own labors. Maybe you add in some chocolate chips or some whatever, some olives or whatever you're adding to the dough. That's an additional material cost. And maybe you're applying some more overhead. So you've got costs that get transferred in. You've got your own costs that you're adding, and then you transfer all of those costs to the next department. And they do the same thing. They add more costs, they transfer to the next department, and so on until you have a finished product. At that point, you know the total cost, right? Because the product's done. And that, what do we call that stage of inventory? The goods are finished? Finished goods. Okay, let's see. We went through this example with the drumstick company. We talked about all of that. Okay, so these are the steps you go through. So with this drumstick company, we started off with these two formulas that, as you might recall, they both include units to account for, sometimes called units accounted for, but it's the same number in both formulas, right? One of them takes your beginning work in process inventory, adds how many units you started working on. The other one says how many units did you complete and how many are left over that are still in process. And both cases get you the same result. Those two ways of looking really at the same thing. And then we use that information. So for example, if they completed 7,500 units during the period and they have 1,200 left over, we see those numbers here. Remember that our total column is the same as our material column, right? Why is that? Why are those two columns always the same? Yeah, materials are always 100%. So if you start making 1,000 cookies, using 1,000 cookies worth of material, well, that batch is always going to be 1,000 cookies, right? If you're going to start making more cookies, that would be a new batch. So in a sense, you kind of don't even need that column, right? But it's there for reference. Now, you might also remember this completed and transferred out. You always have the same number in all three columns. Why is the conversion units always the same as total and material units for completed and transferred out? Would it make sense to transfer to the next department some units that have not completely been converted? No. That department has to do all of its conversion before it transfers those units out, right? And so they have to be completely converted. If they're not completely converted, then they remain in work in process. So we have 1,200 units in this case that are still in process. And in this example, let's see, they are 35% converted. Now, I mentioned this on Tuesday, but I'll mention it again. We don't know what that exactly means, 35%. So if we're making cookies, it could mean that 35% of them are done, but we just haven't transferred them out to the next department. Or it could mean that all of the 1,200 are 35% done. Maybe they're still in the oven. They're not even halfway baked yet. Whatever it means, whatever that 35% means, doesn't really matter. We just take that percentage that we were given, multiply it by the number of units that are in process, and that gets us what? Well, what do we call it? Starts with an E.
Equivalent unit.
What's that?
Equivalent unit.
Equivalent units or conversion. Sometimes you'll hear equivalent units for materials, but we know the equivalent units for materials is always the same as the total, so don't really worry about that. What we care about is equivalent units for conversion, because that is going to be a different number. And then we can take that number, add it to the ones that were completely converted to get our total equivalent units for conversions, because that's the number that we need to figure out the conversion cost per unit. We'll take our conversion costs and divide it by that number to get our conversion cost per unit. Okay? Which is what's happening here. Total conversion costs divided by the equivalent units for conversion gets us our conversion cost per unit. We have our material cost per unit. We add them together, we get a total cost per unit. So we wouldn't know that answer. We wouldn't know those costs per unit if we didn't go through that process. All right. Does anything I've mentioned need any clarification, or does anyone have questions? I did start recording, didn't I? I did. Okay. I'm not OCD. I just know I'm forgetful sometimes, so I go back and check. Okay. So then once we have that cost per unit, we can take our material cost per unit, multiply it by the number of units we transferred out, take our conversion cost per unit, multiply it by the number of units we transferred out, and we know the total cost of those units we transferred out, right? And then you might remember we could also just take this total cost per unit and multiply that by the 7,500 we transferred out. And that would be a little quicker. That would get us the same number. But to figure out the cost of what's still in ending inventory, we can't just add them together because we have different equivalent unit amounts and we have different costs. So we have to multiply each of those separately, add those totals together to get a grand total. Now we know our total work in process inventory cost, which we can then add to our transferred out cost to get our total cost. Okay. We went through one of these tables. Actually, I think we did several of these, so you could kind of see the steps. Again, the way the table is laid out, it's not 100% intuitive of where you start and what you do next. So hopefully you've taken some notes about the steps. We'll be practicing this a little bit more today, I'm sure. Let's see, anything you all want to ask? Any questions? Okay, as I mentioned earlier, the costs get transferred from department to department. So we see, for example, the mixing department had these material and conversion costs. And then when they were done with that batch, those costs got transferred to work in process inventory for the next department. So, this was the drumstick example, I believe. Oh, this is the next department. This was the packaging department that packages the drumsticks, right? And we saw in this case, they had some beginning work in process. So what does that mean to have in your department beginning work in process? Well, what would that be in English instead of accounting language? Somebody asks you, hey, I'm taking this accounting class and I don't understand. What is beginning work in process? How would you explain it?
What you have that you're already working on?
Okay, yeah. It's what you have that you're already working on at the beginning of the period. So these would be products you started making last period. And then at the beginning of this period, they were still there in your department. That is your beginning work in process. And so we see that the packaging department had 750 units they were working on. 7,500 more units got transferred in. They're like, hey, we didn't even finish that 750, and now here's a whole 10 times more coming in. So that means now they've got 8,250 units to work on. Now they didn't get them all done. At the end of the period, they still had 1,750 that were incomplete, which is almost, it's more than double what they had at the beginning of the period. So they're a little bit behind schedule, it looks like. But they did complete 6,500 units and they were able to transfer those and get them out of the department, right? If you're in a production process, that's your goal. Stuff keeps coming in, you want to process it and get it out, right? Otherwise you get behind. All right. So the ones that they transferred out, those 6,500, we can see them here. The 1,750 that they did not complete, that's the ending work in process. They were 40% complete. So that 1,750 was only 40% complete. So we call that 700 equivalent units for conversion, right? And then we can use that gave them a total of 7,200 equivalent units for conversion. We use that to figure out cost per unit for conversion, which we can add to the material cost per unit to get a total cost per unit. I also pointed out that this department, because costs were getting transferred in and they were adding their own costs, we can see that down here. So they had their, for example, the material costs of what they already had at the beginning of the period, plus everything they incurred during the period. That includes anything that got transferred in terms of materials and any materials they added themselves, because they, for example, needed to shrink wrap drumsticks. Well, shrink wrap is a material, right? So there would be a cost involved. So all of that gets added to get our total material cost. Same thing with conversion. There were some conversion costs from the last period that haven't gotten transferred out yet. More conversion costs got transferred in from another department when they transferred their drumsticks over. Plus, this department added its own conversion cost for this period. So all of that gives us our total conversion cost divided by our equivalent units, which we got right there. And that gave them the conversion cost per unit. And then you can figure out how much then was the cost of what got transferred out of that department versus what's still in ending inventory. So you might be thinking, aren't there computers that track all this stuff? And yeah, there are. But you need to understand what computers are doing, right? And not every company has a sophisticated enough system to rely on automation. So sometimes managerial accountants have to calculate this on their own. Okay, and that's as far as we got. So, any questions out there? All right. Well, now we have another problem, number 3. We didn't do problem 3, right? So let's do that now. Oops. Do that now. All right, so you can go ahead and open up your problem sets. Okay, I'll get us started on this. Let's just see how far we need to go together. Okay, oh yeah. Okay, so problem number 3. So we really don't need this information here. We are going to need some information out of this table here. They tell us ending inventory is 100% complete regarding materials. You might remember it always is 100% complete, right? So we don't really care about that. But we do care about the 70% complete regarding conversion. Okay, so we do need to know how converted is the ending inventory. We have the total materials cost. We have the total conversion cost. The company transferred out 17,000 units in this scenario. What is the value of the inventory transferred out and the value of the ending inventory? Okay. So up here, this information is all units, but we're being asked about value. So we have to figure out the costs. Here, it looks like this is all going to be units. But notice in this table, the bottom part talks about costs. And then this section is all costs down here. So this is a little bit of a challenging one, I would say. Where would we start? Obviously, the first table. But as I mentioned, these first 3 rows are talking about units. What'd you say, Lizbel? Figuring out the units. Okay, so we know that they had beginning inventory of 500 units. Plus they started another 20,500. Giving them 21,000 to account for. Could we put that here under accounted for?
Yes.
That's a good place to start there. Whoops. That didn't work. Let's try that again. 21,000, okay. Let's see. The company transferred out 17,000 units. We need that, 17,000 units. So, and then that can go also under conversion, right? Because completed and transferred out is the same number all the way across. So how many units are in ending work in process inventory? Exactly. The difference of 4,000. Okay. What is our equivalent units for conversion? Okay, that is correct. And how'd you get that, Robert?
You can spell your process inventory by your second version.
Okay, we take that 4,000 ending inventory number, multiply it by the 70% converted, and that gives us 2,800 equivalent units for conversion, which is a total of 19,800 equivalent units for conversion. Okay, that right there is the tricky part. So does anybody have any question about why it's 2,800 or why it's 19,800? Any question? Yes. Yep. So we took the 4,000 units that are in ending work in process inventory. Okay, those are the ones that have not been completed yet, and they were 70% complete. So you just multiply the 4,000 ending work in process inventory by the 70% complete, and we see that's 2,800 equivalent units. And then we just add that to the 17,000 that were completely converted to get 19,800. Okay, great. And then they told us the material costs up here. We can put that here under costs. They told us conversion costs. We'll put that over here under the conversion costs. And then we could simply add those together to get our total costs. So materials plus conversion, $93,576. Okay, does that make sense? Now we can figure out our cost per unit. How do we do that? Okay. Costs for the materials divided by the number of units of materials, which is 21,000, gives us $2.74. Can we do the same thing with conversion? We'll take the conversion cost divided by the equivalent units of conversion, and we get $1.82. Now, they didn't give us a place for it, but let's go ahead and add these together. And right here, I'm going to put the total cost per unit, because that might come in handy. So $4.56 is the total cost per unit. Great. So we finished the first table. Are there any questions from that first table? Well then, see if you can complete the second table on your own. What we're trying to do here is figure out the costs for what got transferred out. So that'll go in the first box. The costs for materials for what's in ending work in process, the cost for conversion for what's in ending work in process. You'll add these two together to get your total work in process cost. which you'll then add to the transferred out to get your total costs. And if you do it right, the cost accounted for should be the same as these total costs. Okay, that's your mission, should you choose to accept it. So I'll give you a minute or two, a couple minutes, and see if you can come up with all those answers. At least for posterity's sake, is that what they say? We will show the answers. So for future students looking that didn't get to hear our wonderful explanations that you all shared, at least they'll get to see if they got the right answers. Okay. So now let's go back to our chapter and see what's next. Journal entries, okay. So of course, everything gets journalized, right? Every financial transaction has to get recorded to the journal, even if it's just transferring costs from one department to the next. Well, it has to go in the journal. You're fine. Okay. So in this transaction, all the company did was order some raw materials or receive some raw materials. And you can see here, they have not paid for them yet. Do we know what job, what department these raw material costs are going into? We don't know, right? At this point, it's just raw material inventory. Now, at this point, we can see some of those raw material costs are going into work in process for the shaping department. Some of those materials are going into manufacturing overhead. Why would we put some of the material costs in manufacturing overhead? Because they're indirect, because they cannot be traced directly to a specific product. Maybe those materials ended up getting scrapped. Maybe they're just too hard to measure, whatever it is. Some of them $400 worth. We know we have the costs, but we just couldn't apply them to a particular department. Whereas here, we know that this amount of material costs is getting used by that department to make products. Here, I think we have the same sort of thing going on. Yeah, just for the packaging department, that's the only difference here. Okay, for labor, here we've got some wages payable. So we haven't paid these workers yet, but we know that they've earned some money. And normally, what we're used to is we would debit wage expense or something along those lines. But in this case, we don't do it that way, right? We either put the cost directly, if it's direct labor, into a work in process account. Here we see this is for the shaping department. So this would be labor for the shaping department. Or if it's indirect labor, because it can't be associated with a particular department's production, then it goes into manufacturing overhead. In this other example, same thing, just different department. Okay? All of these costs are getting tracked, and they have to be tracked in the right department. Then we get to the end, and we need to apply some overhead. So we know the overhead formula, right? We learned that last week, I believe. Take your estimated overhead, divide it by your estimated activity. That's how you get your rate. In this case, the activity is machine hours. And so the rate came out to $10 of overhead per machine hour. So then what you do is you see how many machine hours were used and you multiply by $10. And then that's the amount of overhead you take out of the manufacturing overhead account, where really everything goes, right? Except for direct labor and direct materials. All other costs related to production go into that manufacturing overhead account. So you have to take out some of that manufacturing overhead and apply it to that particular department. Again, same thing here, just different department. So since the rate is $10 of overhead per machine hour, how many machine hours were used in the shaping department?
So this
700. Yeah, you can just divide that $7,000 by the $10 per hour and see it's based on 700 machine hours. Okay. All right, then if you remember with the drumstick scenario, they start with the raw wood and they shape it. They turn it into the shape of a drumstick. So that's the first department. And then the second department packages them up. So that's what we see here. We're seeing some costs being transferred out of work in process for the shaping department into work in process for the packaging department. Let's think back. This is an inventory type of account, right? But both of those are inventory accounts. What type of account is inventory? An asset, right? And so it's increasing because it's coming into the packaging department. That's why we're debiting. And it's decreasing because it's coming out of the shaping department, and that's why we're crediting. Okay, then once those drumsticks are fully packaged, they're now finished goods, right? So it's coming out of work in process inventory into finished goods inventory. That's not the final step. What's the final step going to be? Sales, and for inventory purposes,
revenue,
what?
revenue.
Cost of goods sold, yeah. Finally, the last stage is it gets transferred out of finished goods into cost of goods sold, and now it's an expense. All right, so I think this is a preview. Let's see. Or is this a review? I don't remember what this is. Oh, here it is. Yeah, it's the packaging department. Okay. So this is a review of the packaging department. Okay. We have time. I think it might be useful. I know this is not the most exciting thing, but let's do a review of what happened here in the packaging department. So at the beginning of the period, they had $8,180 of work in process inventory, right? That would be any material, labor, and any overhead that was carried over from the last period. So they have those costs at the beginning of this period. Now they're adding more materials, more labor, more overhead within their own department, but they also had some costs transferred in from the department before them. They got some more inventory transferred in along with the costs. So this gives us the total cost to account for this period, for this department. Over here, we can see units, the number of units they had at the beginning, the number of units they started, and the total units to account for. And the ones that they started are the ones that got transferred in from the other department. Okay, now that units to account for equals this units to account for, right? Which shows us they completed 6,500 units, and they have 1,750 still in process. The conversion is 40% complete on the ones that are still in process. So we multiply that by the 1,750. That's how we got 700 equivalent units for conversion, which gave us a total of 7,200 equivalent units for conversion, right? So this was ending work in process equivalent units for conversion, ending work in process equivalent units for conversion. That's an 8-sentence, an 8-word phrase. This is ending work in process equivalent units for production. This is total equivalent units for converting, right? So that's the difference between the two. This is ending work in process. This is total. That total is the one that we can divide into the total conversion cost to get our conversion cost per unit. Same thing with materials. Total number of materials divided into the materials cost to get a material cost per unit. Add them together, we have our total cost per unit, right? Then we can figure out the cost of what got transferred out, the cost of ending work in process materials, ending work in process conversion, total ending work in process. And we add that to the transferred out and we get our total cost. And again, if you notice this total cost, sorry, my battery's running low. Use my finger. Okay, this total cost equals that total cost, which helps validate that our numbers must be right. But again, the reason we have to go through all this is so we know how much to transfer out and how much is still in process. Okay. So hopefully you kind of get that idea how we use this table. Does anyone have any questions? It works. No, that doesn't work. Okay. All right, so let's look at some more journal entries. They sell 500 units of 2 drumsticks paired up. So it's 1,000 drumsticks, but we're calling it 500 units. And the selling price is $24.99. So if you multiply 500 by $24.99, that's $12,495 of accounts receivable and sales. Okay. It's a lot of drumsticks, right? And the cost of goods sold, as I mentioned before, is now an expense. Under the expense recognition principle, we now have revenue that we can match with that expense. So that inventory is no longer an asset, right? We took it out of finished goods inventory. That's $4,200 that our assets are going down and $4,200 that our expenses are going up, which, as you might recall, reduces our equity. But because of the matching principle, that's the way we have to do things. Oh, and summary. Okay. Snuck up on me. Wow. I have another hour to kill here. I don't know what we're going to do with all this time. All right, well, let's summarize.
The whole problem.
All the problems?
Take a vote.
Well, what we've done in the past is once we've covered the problems that I intended to go over, people who want to stick around and go over other problems will gladly do that. So we can certainly go over, I can't guarantee we'll get through all of them, but we could try. You can see how much we can get done. So what have we learned? We learned that process costing we use for mass production, right? Because it just makes sense. You wouldn't use job order costing if you're doing the same thing over and over and over. Instead, you keep track of the costs for each process, meaning each department. And let's see, we need to use this equivalent units because at the end of the period, we'll have some ending work in process inventory that's not fully converted, right? So we have to use this concept of equivalent units so that we can figure out what is our conversion cost per unit and figure out the cost of what to transfer out. All right, we know that the equivalent units in terms of materials is always going to match the total units as well. So really the only place where it's different is with conversion, right? That's where the equivalent units is going to be less than the material units. And what else? Let's see, total units to account for can be calculated two ways. You got your beginning plus whatever you started during that period, or what got transferred out and your ending inventory also equals your units to account for. And again, the way we get the cost per unit, you take your cost for materials divided by the units of materials. You take your conversion cost divided by the equivalent units for conversion, right? That's how we get cost per unit for both. So I kind of said this already. And then inventory gets transferred out of the department to the next department or eventually into finished goods. All right. So I'll stop the recording and we can go back into, did we finish the exercise set?
Yeah.